My name is Robert Gregory, CEO of the Australian Jewish Association. Now, the Albanese government has stood by while our community, the Jewish community, has faced an unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism. Many in the Jewish community have now become fearful that the Albanese government will weaponize our concerns and instead use them to bring in new laws which will actually end up outlawing the teaching of traditional Jewish and other religious views on morality by treating them as vilification. My guest to talk about these issues is Pat Byrne, former president of the National Civic Council, the organization which was founded by the late Bob Santamaria. Pat has written extensively on defense and foreign affairs, on anti-discrimination and anti-vilification laws, and on many other issues in the NCC's magazine, News Weekly. We're going to discuss matters which everyone should anticipate in the proposed new federal anti-hate speech or anti-vilification bill that many are expecting this month from Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus. Thank you for joining the AJA today, Pat.
Nice to be here with you.
Now, I'll start by asking what the situation is federally and what are concerns that religious people have and should have about what Attorney General Mark Dreyfus might do.
Mark Dreyfus has said he would introduce this month a new hate speech bill saying he would strengthen existing laws while creating new offences carrying criminal rather than civil penalties, and is likely to cover deliberate acts that intend to incite violence or cause harm. He said he will extend the safeguards in federal criminal law to protect all attributes. So these attributes go beyond race and religion. They go into gender, sexuality, disability, and a whole range of other things potentially. The pretense, I think, for this, or the grounds for it, is he's saying that this is because of the upsurge in anti-Semitism and the conflicts that are going on in various demonstrations we see around Australia over the last year or so. But we already have laws that cover violence, damage to property, anti-hate speech. And the only way I can see, well, we haven't seen his bill yet, but the only way I can see this, him saying he's going to extend this, is to actually lower the bar on anti-hate speech and vilification, which I always think runs the risk of leading into lawfare and leading to even more incitement as communities go for each other. Now, Senator Michaela Cash has signalled concerns about relying on civil administration law to address vilification, and said existing criminal laws and other laws should be used and enforced first. And the question is why the federal and state aren't enforcing those laws already.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question that many in our community have. But we do have some worrying precedents in other states. So could you speak a bit about what has happened in different states around Australia?
Yes, I'd like to, because the states vary, both federal and state. Some have fairly high bars in terms of anti-hate speech. High bars, I say, by Australian standards. For example, the Victorian Racial and Religious Tolerance Act covers race and religion. And says bans conduct that incites hatred against or serious contempt for or revulsion or serious ridicule of a person or group. In New South Wales is similar. In race, it covers an act to incite hatreds or serious contempt or serious ridicule of a person or a group. On religion, it says it's an act that promotes or expresses hatred towards serious contempt or severe ridicule of a person or group. Then you go to the other extreme, which is the very low bar set in the Federal Racial Discrimination Act. That is an act that is reasonably likely to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate another person or group. The Northern Territory has very similar legislation, almost exactly the same words, reasonably likely. And the problem with the word likely is it means probably, but not certainly. What one person may say is likely to incite vilification or harm, another person would say is not certain or likely. So likely is the law is supposed to be precise in what it says in order to give certainty in its protections. And the word likely, for example, leaves it wide open. Tasmania has similar legislation. Its vilification covers race but not religion, but it says conduct which offends, insults, intimidates, insults or ridicules another person. And we saw in Tasmania during the debate over the marriage issue that the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart, Julian Porteous, was hauled before a tribunal simply for expressing what his church teaches on the issue of marriage. That was considered offensive to other people. I also want to point to a new bill that we're seeing in Queensland, which I think is particularly serious. It has two forms of vilification. Once again, it is like the Racial Discrimination Act, conduct that is likely to incite hatred or serious contempt for. That is one grounds for vilification. But the other one I find quite extraordinary. It says an act that a reasonable person would consider hateful towards or reviling or seriously contemptuous of another person or group. Now, you might say a reasonable person, okay, you could pick a person in the street and they might say, no, that's not contemptuous or hateful. But the point is they go on to define a reasonable person as a person from the same identity group as the person making the complaint. So, for example, if you had a Jewish group under this, if it covered this particular area that made comments about certain protests going on, and those protesters said this was hateful and reviling towards them, then the courts would be turning to the same identity group to determine whether that is the case or not. I mean, this is the extension of the law into areas where it simply shouldn't go. Finally, on this, other countries have in anti-hate and vilification laws that set to a fairly high level. Statements, for example, that intentionally cause person harassment, alarm or distress. That's what they've got in the UK or have had in the UK. And Canada says incitement that is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. Breaching the peace or violence, I think, is really the point at which hate speech should be levelled.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be very nervous about some of these subjective terms, like insult, offend, and then giving the authorities the power to decide what's in breach of it.
Or likely to offend. That's the what a reasonable person would regard. And who's a reasonable person? A person from the same identity group who's saying they're offended. I mean, this is entirely subjective.
Exactly, and the authorities don't have the best record as well, so people should rightly be concerned. Could you tell us a bit about the organization which you headed, the National Civic Council?
Yes, we
would be familiar, yeah, but for those not.
Yes, we were formed in 1941 by the late B.A. Santamaria, originally to take on the issue of the communist penetration of the trade unions. We had a long battle in those unions. In the 1950s, that caused a split in the Labor Party because the influence that that part of the organisation had that led to the creation of the Democratic Labor Party. We are an organisation based on 5 primacies: the integrity of the human person, the family is the central unit of society, decentralisation of political, economic power and population, patriotism, love of one's country and defence of it, and finally, Judeo-Christian principles as the foundation stone of Western civilization. So we've had a long history of involvement in many issues, including great defenders of the State of Israel.
Well, I think a lot of the things your organization stands for are under attack right now, so it's more important than ever before.
Right across the culture everywhere, yes.
Exactly. So I want to thank you for your clear explanation of these laws. And we do know that these type of laws, they have a silencing effect, as you brought up, that even when they're not successful claims against religious people, we know the financial, the reputational, the mental costs of lawfare, as you described it, it can be enormous. So it's an issue that Jewish Australians and all Australians of religion and even not of religion should be following very closely with concern what this government may do. So thank you again, Pat, for joining me and for your very clear explanation.
You're most welcome. Nice to be here with you.